In this video, I want to take everything that we've done in Module 1 and combine it all together so that we can take a data set and provide a concise description of it that tells us a lot of important information about the data set. And I want to start off by pointing out that what I'm going to present here is not the only way in which you could describe a data set. There's lots of other information you could provide. What I'm going to present here is a way of describing a data set that will include all of the information that we'll want in this class. So it's not to say that this is the right way to do it, but it's a nice way to quickly summarize a data set to have all of the information that we need. Okay, so right here in front of us is a data set. And so we're told that this data set consists of the weights in ounces of a bunch of cereal boxes. This is from later in the workbook. So the first thing I'm going to do in my description of the data set is to say what the data set describes. So let's flip over to where I'll write my answer here. So if I'm describing this data set, the first thing I'm going to say is that the data set consists of the weights in ounces of 100 cereal boxes. So that's the first piece of information that I want to include. Now I want to summarize this data set. I want to provide some summary statistics and identify some important features. So in order to do that, I'm going to go into RStudio and I'm going to enter the data set and I'm going to call it cereal. I'll copy and paste this here. Click enter. So now we have the data set entered into RStudio. And what I want to do is I want to know the median and the IQR of the data set. And I can get that information using the summary command. So here we see that the median is 20. And to get the IQR, you could maybe do it in your head, but I'll actually just take the third quartile, 20.7, and subtract the first quartile, 18.95, and that gives me 1.75. Let's flip back to our description of the data set. So the rest of this is going to come as a bulleted list. So we saw that the median was 20 ounces. And we saw that the IQR is 1.75 ounces. So those are the summary statistics that I'm going to provide. And now I want to look at two other things. I want to know whether this distribution is skewed and whether it has outliers. To see if it's skewed, let's go back into RStudio. And in order, we'll actually want to plot some things. So to see skew of a distribution, we're going to have to look at a histogram of that distribution. And let's quickly get a histogram of this data set. So this serial distribution appears to be slightly left skewed. There's a bit longer of a tail off to the left side. So I'll write that down. The distribution is slightly left skewed. And finally, I want to know if there are any outliers in the distribution. Now we have a method for calculating outliers, but if you're already in software, a box plot will tell you whether there's outliers. So if I go back to this here, I can create a box plot. And we see that there's one outlier. That's this circle in the box plot. So I'm going to note that the lowest value is an outlier. And actually, I realize as I look at this, if we go to our data set again, there's actually 4 outliers, but it's hard to see in the picture. So you do want to be careful here. We have 4 values that are 16. So it's actually the lowest 4 values. So let me fix that here. I'll say something like the lowest 4 values are outliers. And for us, the important thing is whether there are outliers. So it's sometimes looking at a box plot, you might say, well, what about that value 16.2? Is that an outlier? That's not really that important for our purposes. And I'm done. This is my description of the data set. All right, so I want to say just a bit more about what I included here. Hopefully I made it clear how I got all this stuff. So the first thing I did here was I gave some context to the numbers, right? We started out with just this list of 100 numbers and a longer description of it. But here what I included was information on the numbers in particular. I included what the cases are and what the variable is. So the cases are just the thing that the data set's measuring. The individuals or things in the sample. And so here the cases are the serial boxes. And the variable is the thing that describes the cases, in this case, the weights in ounces of those boxes. So we have a quick sentence describing the cases and the variable so that we know what these numbers represent. Next, I gave you the median. Next, I said what the IQR was. So I think those are relatively straightforward. Here, I talked about the shape of the distribution in the third part, and in particular, what we want here is right skewed or left skewed, or maybe roughly symmetric. For our purposes, skew is what's going to be really important. And then finally, are there outliers? And so I guess if you wanted like a mnemonic here, median, IQR, skew, or shape, outliers, so MISO, I guess could be a mnemonic. This is the information I want. Now, I don't really care if you provide this information in a different format. That's fine. As I said at the beginning of the video, there are lots of things you could describe about a distribution, but I will point out that this format is really easy to read. There's something to be said for, we're not trying to win a literary prize here, right? We're just trying to provide information, and bulleted lists can be really useful. I can get a lot of information out of this list about this data set. All right, so the final thing I wanted to say was connect this to the workbook. So in the workbook, you may have noticed that there's this mnemonic CUSS. And I just want to point out that what I've said here is not different from the workbook. It's just a bit more specific and more organized. So in the mnemonic CUSS, C is for center. And so here I gave the median as a measure of center. You could also give the mean if you wanted to. I prefer the median when describing data sets because it has a very natural interpretation. This tells us that half of the cereal boxes weigh more than 20 ounces, half weigh less than 20 ounces. If you actually read through the context of this problem, they were trying to figure out whether cereal boxes were 20 ounces on average, and knowing that the middle number, separating the bottom and top half is 20 ounces, is a useful piece of information. The mean's a bit harder to interpret. Okay, the next thing in this mnemonic U is unusual features, and really what we care about there is outliers. And so I guess you could report other unusual features, but we really care about outliers here. The next S is spread, and I gave you the IQR. That's a measure of spread. You also could give the standard deviation as a measure of spread. I prefer the IQR when describing a distribution because it has a nice interpretation. This is saying that the middle half of cereal boxes are within 1.75 ounces in weight of each other, whereas the standard deviation is a bit more complicated to understand what it's saying. I'll point out, range is not the same as spread. Telling me that the cereal boxes range in weights from 16 ounces to 22 ounces is not useful information. In particular, one of those values, 16 ounces, is an outlier. So that's not really that useful. All right, the final S is shape. And here I described the shape. And again, what I cared about was skew. And why we care about outliers and skew will become apparent later in the course. It has to do with hypothesis testing and confidence intervals and understanding when data sets are useful for certain procedures. All right, so hopefully that was useful. This is a good template for how you describe a data set. You don't have to follow it, but I recommend trying it. I think it's easier than recreating the wheel each time and coming up with your own way of doing it.